All right, friends in the Beehive State, we have taken our break. We have, sorry we couldn't offer you a kolache, but take our word for it, they were delicious. And you'll have to make do with whatever you have there. Anyway, this is round two. We're beginning again. We're going to turn to Genesis chapter 22 and one of the most famous passages in Scripture, the sacrifice of Isaac. And this is important on several grounds, as we're going to see. And I know you know the story very well, so I'm not going to presume just to tell the story again, except to point out just a few things, some of which we've already mentioned. One of the most striking, of course, is Abraham's ready response. A man who planned with his wife to deceive deliberately in different places where they went about their own marriage, which put his wife at risk. I mean, this is astounding, which prompts me to say, I think I've said this before, but it bears reminding ourselves that Jeremiah says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, who can know it? We are capable of some pretty bad stuff. And it's amazing how in the life of a man such as Abraham, the model of faith, the father of the faithful, in the same heart can reside this settled plan to deceive. And at the same time, he's called upon to sacrifice his son. He responds instantly. I think I mentioned this in the class yesterday about the Apostle, the movie The Apostle. Did I? Or no? Somewhere else. Good. I'm talking all the time, so I don't know what I say where. I better tell the truth because, as Abraham Lincoln said, nobody can remember well enough to be a liar. So, but there's a movie titled The Apostle. Robert Duvall is the star, and he produced it, I think, or directed it. I don't know this term very well, but Robert Duvall said of that movie that it was a movie he felt he had to make. Not sure why exactly, but anyway, it centers on a preacher whose wife, it turns out, is involved in an affair with I think it's the youth pastor of the church or something. And he kills him in a fit of rage. And then flees and becomes a fugitive and assumes an identity and starts a church in Louisiana. And the church flourishes, and he's a faithful preacher. And it's an amazing, amazing psychological study of how a man, on the one hand, can be a murderer, which he was, granted in a fit of rage, but still, he murdered a man. And at the same time, be preaching and pastoring and changing people's lives. And the very end of it, he's finally caught up with it. And at the very end of it, this young man whose life has been so dramatically impacted by the apostle is just weeping because he's being taken away. It's an amazing. I encourage you to see it. It's an amazing, amazing story, and it's true to life. I mean, it's exactly the kind of thing that you could imagine is possible. That in the same person, these two things coexist. That's Abraham. We just got through reading that he plotted with his wife to deceive everybody. And yet, when God says, take your son, your only son Isaac, of course Ishmael was a son too, we know what that means, the son of promise, whom you love, emphasizing the affection that he had for him, and go to the land of Moriah. Now we notice we are told later on that Solomon builds the temple on Mount Moriah, and you go to Jerusalem today, and the guides will point out Mount Moriah, of course, which is not the highest mountain, by the way, in Jerusalem.
Isn't that where the Dome of the Rock is?
That's where the Dome of the Rock is. Not wide. And as you know from having been there, it's downhill from the uppermost part of Jerusalem. Go down to it. But compared to the surrounding valley, it's a mountain. But we're not told here he went to Mount Moriah. We're told he went to the land of Moriah. So, and it may well have been that very mountain, but just notice that he's directed to go to the land of Moriah. So it was a region which undoubtedly encompassed the mountain on which the sacrifice took place, or was to take place. So offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, let me stop right here and point out something. Ethics has been kind of our theme here for good reason. And here's another text that is a case in point. All through the Bible, no exception except here, God condemns in the strongest possible language child sacrifice. But God commands it here. How can we reconcile that God commands what everywhere else he strictly forbids? That's a hard question. Let's move on, and we won't leave it hanging. We'll answer it, but let's move along. So you know this. You know how the story unfolds. I said this passage introduces us to. It's important for more reasons than one. And one of the interesting things about this passage, and it's really more implied. It's kind of a theme that works its way through. It's not emphasized. Attention is not called to it, but it's very real, and that is the role of Isaac in all of this. In that Isaac at this point is probably himself a teenager, and Isaac speaks in verse 7, and he says to his father, "My father, here am I, my son." He said, "Behold," he's been around enough to know how sacrifice works. "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" And, you know, we've talked a lot in Genesis about what I would call the psychology of these accounts. We always have to remember these people are real people. They're not robots. They're not automatons. These are real human beings with real human feelings. Take Isaac, your only son, whom you love. And I think it's hard for us even to begin to fathom how that must have torn at the heartstrings of Abraham to have his son ask, "Where is the burnt offering?" knowing Isaac is the offering. And whether Abraham answered the way he did, maybe it was a mixture of things. He, as we know, he doesn't answer directly. He says, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son."
I don't know how he could have kept a dry eye.
Yeah, how could you control your emotions? How could you do that? That just is hard to imagine. So again, we know from the writer of Hebrews that he believed that even if he had to sacrifice his son, that God could raise him from the dead. And the fact that he had given him his son in the first place, no doubt convinced Abraham that this God can do anything. But that doesn't, in a way, alleviate the psychological drama here, because even with what the writer of Hebrews says, he still might have been thinking that God is going to go through it. We have no reason to believe that Abraham thought that God was going to stop him in mid-air Yes, he did. We have no reason to think that at all. And the proof of that is that he went through it. He was about to plunge the dagger. But I said it tells us something about Isaac because Isaac was old enough to resist. He was old enough to ask questions. He was old enough to know what's going on. At some point it dawned on him whether Abraham told him outright or whether he, it's hard. We don't know. We're not told. All we're told is when they came to the place, Abraham built the altar and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son. As some scholars have pointed out, he didn't bind Isaac because Isaac was kicking and springing. In fact, quite the opposite. Isaac wasn't resisting at all. He could have. And at Abraham's advanced age, if Isaac wanted to leave, there's no way Abraham could have stopped him. There's no way. So the binding was simply a part of the ritual itself. It's a part of the scripture often speaks of binding the sacrifice with cords upon the altar. So that's all this reference. Symbolic. So he binds his son Isaac, laid him on top of the altar, on top of the wood, and Isaac reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And the angel of the Lord called, as you know. And here we come across another anthropomorphism where God speaks in human ways. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. God knew all along. God didn't learn here that Abraham had this kind of faith. I want to read you a quote. It comes from a liberal, but as I love to say, in the analog world at least, even a broken clock is right twice a day. In the analog world. In the digital world, that's not true. But oh, man. But a liberal biblical Old Testament scholar named James Crenshaw. You know, even out of the mouths of liberals, once in a while you get great quotes, and so this is one. James Crenshaw says that in this account, and I'm not sure he believed anything about God whatsoever, but he said that this command of God presents to Abraham the great question. To what extent will he obey? What does it, and here's the quote directly, what does it mean to fear God when God makes hard demands? What does it mean to fear God when God makes hard demands? And God knew what Abraham was going to do. God never had any doubt about that. He didn't learn it here, just as God didn't ask questions to get information. But Abraham has to face this. I say that I believe God. Do I? It's easy to say, but how do you know? Well, you don't know until you're faced with trial. That's the only way you know. It's like flying, building an airplane and flying it. Well, engineers say it will fly. It has all the right characteristics, all the right aerodynamics, the right material, but will it fly? Well, we don't know. Somebody's got to get in and go up. Well, okay, that's a tremendous account. Of course, we know that how the story ends. God stays the hand of Abraham. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, this sounds like what Hagar saw in the wilderness when God opens her eyes to see the well. Was the ram there all the time? Well, we don't know. We're not told that. But it does say, behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And it doesn't suggest that it just happened. Almost like it was there all the time. But which would have been a great, if it were there the whole time, it would have been a great lesson. He turns around, God opens his eyes to see the ram, and now Abraham knows God had this plan all the time. He never intended for me to take Isaac's life. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Well, after this, of course, and I have two more comments to make about the account, but the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time and said, by myself I have sworn, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you, and I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand of the sea. And your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. It's worth commenting on this kind of renewal of the covenant that we see here, because it sounds as if, notice what it says, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you. Well, this is taking us back to Genesis 12. In Genesis 12, God made a covenant with Abraham. And he would bless him, multiply him, give him a land, bless the nations through him. And now he seems to say, because you've done this, I will do all these things. But we already know that God had made this promise. And it's not conditional. So, we see this in other places. There are other places in Scripture where God makes a covenant that is unconditional. It's unilateral. It's His covenant, and nothing that we do or the person does or can do will violate the covenant or break the covenant, I should say. So what does this mean when God says, because you've done this, I will, when He already promised that He would? Well, I'll tell you what I think, and for what it's worth, you can take it or leave it, but I think what this and other passages like this mean is that not that God, the covenant is somehow dependent on the faithfulness of Abraham, but that because of his faithfulness, Abraham will enjoy and, shall we say, benefit from or profit from in some way this covenant that God has made. I mean, as John the Baptist says to those who came out from Jerusalem, God is able of the stones to raise up children of Abraham. God doesn't need your progeny, but if you repent and come to Him, then you get to enjoy the blessings of being who you are. And I think that's what He means here. I don't know. If somebody has a better explanation, I'm open to it, but it doesn't mean that the covenant depends on Abraham. We know that. It doesn't depend on Abraham. But Abraham's enjoyment of the covenant, the first question in the Westminster Catechism, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Well, God is always God. God is always glorious, no matter what we do. But when we glorify Him, we get to enjoy Him forever. I think that's probably the idea here. We find similar. Okay, back to the command. What is our answer? While I nibble on a kolache, which you folks in Utah, I assume, don't have. But what's the answer to the dilemma? If God commands everywhere to prohibit, He detests child sacrifice. Even in a few places says, it never entered into my mind. You do these things that never entered my mind. And yet He commands Abraham to do it.
It has to be a little bit connected, doesn't it, to the fact that God, knowing what will happen, knows that this child will not be sacrificed, but that's only part of it.
It's only part of it. And it doesn't resolve the dilemma.
No.
Because He still commands Abraham to do it.
But you use the word child as opposed to human.
Well,
no, that's a very fine distinction.
Yeah. Although I would say it probably doesn't apply here. The distinction doesn't apply because the reason I mentioned child is that the form that human sacrifice most often took in the ancient world was a child.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, there were other human sacrifices, but the worship of Molech,
Well,
the festival god Molech, was a child
And
sacrifice.
those sacrifices would always have been performed by unbelievers.
Mhm.
Does that have something to do with it?
Well, I don't think so, because what God says is that he detests and he calls them detestable or abominational or abominable practices of the god Molech, who demands this sacrifice of
Oh, but
children.
this is the sacrifice to God, not to an idol.
Mhm.
No.
What he condemns is the
The act
sacrifice,
itself.
the
The act
sacrifice of the child, which would be killing innocent life. Okay. Let me get at it by posing a question that we sometimes ask in ethics classes. Does God command a thing because it's right, or is it right because God commands it? Does God command a thing because it's right, or is a thing right because God commands it?
Right.
That's exactly true. Because if it were the other way around, well, what would be the problem with having it the other way around?
Depends on the definition of right.
Well, even if we use God's definition of right, how would it be different if we said God commands the thing because it's right?
Because then we're deciding what right is.
No, it would be God deciding. God commands it.
We're talking about his character.
We are? What about it?
God's always right. Everything God is.
Okay, here's the problem. If we say that God commands a thing because it's right, that means there's something prior to God. There's something that God has to obey. There is something right that God has to command because it's right. So there's a standard which is above God. So we can't say that. Not as Christians we can't. Now, Stoics would say that. The movie The Gladiator. Gladiator was a Stoic. Marcus Aurelius was emperor of Rome, but also a Stoic philosopher. And the Stoics believe that there is a right, and everything has to obey that right, even the gods. But we don't say that because there's nothing above God. God is not contingent on anything. God does not obey anything. God is God, period. So a thing is right because God commands it. Now, this is a special case. That's one thing that makes this different than Molech. Molech was a practice, part of a religious practice. This is still a hard case. No matter how you slice the apples, this is a hard case. But it's made a little more understandable for us if we remember, first of all, that a thing is right because God commands it. And God's command here is, this is the first and only time ever. And of course, he doesn't go through with it, but that doesn't alleviate the pain because he does command it. But he does it for a specific purpose under very limited conditions. And it's been pointed out many, many times that it may very well be that God was using this particular command as a test for Abraham, because it would have been familiar to Abraham. It would have been a part of his, how should we say this, his intellectual equipment. It would have been a part of his world. It would have been a part of his cultural proper word would be milieu, his world. it was very common in the ancient world to show your devotion to your God in this way. So that when God commands Abraham to do this, he is, in one respect, using something very familiar to Abraham that frankly probably wouldn't have troubled Abraham because it was familiar to him. So he used something familiar to put him to a test. Of course, knowing that he wasn't going to go through with it. But in the process, Abraham learns what God requires. He requires everything, even if it means my own son. But he also learns that God provides and that God won't require him to do this. And that God provides a substitute for this son of his. So he's teaching him the principle of substitution, and he's also teaching him what God requires. As James Crenshaw said, he's forcing Abraham to answer the question, what does it mean to fear God when God makes hard demands, the hardest demand?
And there is no better picture for us of Jesus Christ.
That's right. And you know, that's another part of all this, Miss Miriam, is that this is what God himself did with Christ. He sacrificed his own son. He didn't stay there. That's right, he didn't. Exactly. Wow. So he forbids, in the strongest possible terms, a religious practice that sacrifices children to placate or to gain favors from the gods. He condemns that in no uncertain terms. But at the same time, he says, by using this demand, he teaches Abraham what it means to fear God. And helps us to understand the cross. Wow. Well, that's chapter 23 or 22. At the end of chapter 22, we have, and this is very common in Genesis, these little snippets of information that set the stage for what's coming. They just introduce characters so that when we meet them later on, we know. Now, after these things, it was told to Abraham. He got messages. They didn't have Twitter and Facebook and cell phones, but there was communication. They would, people traveled back and forth and brought messages. And it was told Abraham, behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. We met those back in chapter 11. Uts, his firstborn. Boots, his brother. Kemuel, the father of Aram. Chesed, Hatzo, Pildash, Jidlaph, Bethuel. And parenthetically, verse 23, Bethuel fathered Rebekah. Well, of course, at this point in the storyline, we have no idea what this means, but we do because we read it. We read later chapters, so we know. But if you were reading it for the first time, you wouldn't know, except that you're introduced to some characters. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother, and then others by his concubine, Reumah. So, chapter 23 records the death of Sarah, and turn my page here. And by the way, before I leave those verses 20 through 24, I have had occasion over the years a lot to read liberals, to read books by liberals. And especially in the Old Testament, lots of liberals, and golly, I went to Baylor University, studied all the liberals. I went to Stetson University, which was far to the left of Baylor and had nothing but liberals. By the way, I had a professor at Stetson tell me one time. Stetson is Baptist, or historically Baptist University of Florida. They themselves call it the Yale of the South, whatever. Anyhow, founded with the money or built with the money of John Stetson of the famous Stetson hat. And I had a professor, well, my major professor when I was there, did a master's there, who said, and remember this was a historically Baptist university, and he said, I've given up on the universities hiring Christians. I just wish they would hire people who believe in God. I did a master's there. So I've read all the liberals. And one of the things liberals like to say is that, well, these ancient people were naive and they got confused about things. And they, like they tell, like the story of Isaac and Abimelech and the story of Abraham and Abimelech and the lying about their wives. Most liberals think those are the same story and that they just got confused. And they told it twice and didn't realize what they were doing. Well, passages like this, and there are several of these in Genesis, put the light on all that. Because notice how meticulous they are with the records. Giving names, even the name of his concubine. And she and they don't even enter into the story. And yet we have her name, and we have the names of her sons. It's just incredible. Well, verse 1 of chapter 23. So Sarah lived 127 years. Someone has pointed out, I haven't actually checked this out, so I can't say for sure. But somebody has said that Sarah is the only woman in the Bible whose age is ever mentioned. Lots of men, but Sarah is the only woman. You could take that, a couple of bucks, go to McDonald's, get a cup of coffee. And maybe an order of fries. Or an order of fries, I should say, yes. All right. So Sarah died at Kiryat Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. I mentioned Hebron, south of Jerusalem. By car today, it's not even an hour. It's a short drive, but those days, of course, it was a ways. Kind of in the heart of the highlands south of Jerusalem. And so Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. And Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't even see you.
I hope I can ask this.
Of course you can ask this.
What can you tell me about why she was in Kiryat Arba and he was in Abraham stayed in Beersheba?
Oh, no, I don't. He wasn't in Beersheba. He had moved at this point.
Oh.
It says, I know it says up in verse 19 of 22 that he lived in Beersheba, but in between time, obviously they had moved.
Okay.
And it's not that far. From Beersheba to Hebron is actually not very far.
But it does say that he went to mourn her.
Well, no, it says he went in to mourn for her. That just means.
Oh, it says he went to in this place.
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't mean he moved from Beersheba to Hebron. They weren't separated. They were together. So he rose up for his dead and said to the Hittites, and of course he asked for a place to bury his wife now. And by the way, this is a place too. I'm sure you probably heard this. For years and years and years, liberals, skeptics laughed at the Old Testament because they mentioned Hittites. And they had never found any evidence in secular history, archaeology, of the Hittites. In the late 19th century, archaeologists uncovered the Hittite civilization. It's an amazing story, one of the great stories in the history of archaeology. They uncovered the Hittite civilization. And now, much of what we know about even the covenants that were made in the Old Testament, we know because of the archaeological discoveries of the Hittite civilization. because these are Hittite type covenant treaties that we find in the Old Testament.
Yeah, archaeology just continues right up. It's probably the day we're sitting here
Exactly.
to confirm
Exactly.
everything in the Bible.
It is absolutely amazing what is discovered time and time and time again. Liberals for years have said, well, the Old Testament depiction of David as a great king is just fallacious. I mean, it's fantasy land. It's lionizing. It's later legend mythology kind of creating this suit. I guess it's been now about 4 years ago. Archaeologists discovered, and I've been there. Well, I shouldn't say I've been there. I've been into the archaeological dig, but did you go, Ms. Donna, when you went to Israel? Did you go to the Elah Valley, where David kills Goliath in the Elah Valley? Oh my goodness! Yeah, that's one of the A sites. That's one of the places we know for sure, everybody, because all the sites are exactly the same as they were. The valley is still there. The stream where David got the stones, everything, and they're identified so clearly in Scripture. You can stand there and point out every single thing. You can see it exactly. Well, about 4 years ago, archaeologists uncovered a city very near the Elah Valley. In fact, standing in the Elah Valley, you can see it. It's up on the ridge to the west toward Bethlehem. And you can almost see Bethlehem from there too. You can see where David would have come down to the armies of Saul, down the hill and across the plain. So, archaeologists just discovered this city that they know without question is from the time of David. And it's a magnificent city, and everything about it shows that his greatness is not exaggerated in the Scripture at all. Okay, well, there are things like that. I thought of that because of the Hittites here. Skeptics laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed until the 1880s when they discovered the Hittites. And nobody's laughing now about the Hittites. So Abraham buys the property, as you know, a tomb for Sarah. And actually, it's been pointed out a few times. If you look, let's see. Well, a couple of things to point out about this passage. One is that there's a lot of detail here just for buying a piece of property. And later on we're going to read about Jacob coming back to the land of Canaan, and he buys a plot of land, and it's given to us in like a verse. He buys a plot of land, and that's it. And here we have almost a chapter devoted to the purchase of this cave as a burial place. So that's one thing scholars have wondered about. Why so much detail about this place? And I don't know that we have a full answer to that. One answer might be that it is the burial place of Sarah, and remembering how much emphasis has been placed on Sarah, that maybe it's partly for that reason, but I don't know that we have a full answer to it. But at any rate, another thing that's been pointed out about it is that the price that Ephron gives to Abraham when he says, "I'll buy it for full price," we read in verse 14, Ephron answered Abraham, "My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Well, it's been pointed out more than once. This was quite a sum. This is a lot of money. And we don't necessarily accuse Ephron of price gouging, but boy, it didn't come cheap. He didn't give it to him.
It almost sounds like he would give it to him.
Yeah.
And then that's thrown in.
Yeah, and then Abraham insists on paying and says, "Okay." So once again, we're not altogether sure what to make of all this, but great lengths to describe the burial place, the legal contract, the transaction involved, the price, all of that, and how it was all carried out so meticulously. Abraham Listen to Ephron, verse 16. Weighed out for Ephron the silver, 400 shekels of silver, according to the weights current among the merchants. Making sure we know this was a legal transaction. Abraham had bought. And, you know, here again, we're not told, so we ask, but part of it could be that, maybe in some way God is emphasizing here that Abraham pays a very high price for a small piece of land that someday is all going to be his, as a free gift of God.
Are there many caves in that area?
Lots of caves. Lots and lots.
So it wasn't unique that there was a nice cave there.
Nothing unusual about that at all. They're everywhere. Most of Israel is limestone. And limestone, as you know, is ideal for the formation of caves. Lots and lots. And in fact, burial places like this actually are still visible. You can see them on the roads. There's one outside of Megiddo, on the bust of Megiddo. Drivers always stop there and point. It's a whole hillside with caves like this, full of them, and several of them apparently used as burial sites. And one has a stone in front of it, such as is described in the Gospels. Okay, well, not sure what else to say more about that. Let's go to chapter 24. What did I say? 33? We're doing we're taking chapters at a time here. Yes. Excuse me. Really beginning in chapter 22 and verse 50, we have a section here that's going to take us through chapter 25. Really chapter 25. Someone has referred to this section as preparing for the son of Abraham. This is the build up from chapter 11 all the way to chapter 21 and the birth of Isaac. And now for the next 2 or 3 chapters, the focus is on Isaac himself and preparing him for his role as one of the patriarchs of the 3 great patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we're going to be introduced to Isaac, and so after Sarah dies, we're told Abraham was old, advanced in years, blessed him, and Abraham wants to acquire now a wife for Isaac. And this is a long chapter and a fascinating story. And he calls his servant, who is probably the Gehazi that we mentioned earlier, probably chief steward of his household, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all he had. So, and he makes him take an oath, put your hand under my thigh. Actually, it's probably a little more graphic than that. I don't need to say it, I guess. But anyway, he makes him swear, and the oath is, you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites. Now, it's very interesting, and we can begin to ponder this even at this point. Later on, we have a similar kind of thing in that similar but different. Similar in that Jacob goes to the same region and gets a wives, and concubines and trouble. In that case, his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, send him away. In this case, Abraham refuses to let Isaac go. So similar, not a wife from here, But different in that in this instance, Isaac is not allowed to go, and in that instance, Jacob is basically sent off on its own. So you will not take a wife for my son from the Canaanites, but will go to my country and my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. The reason we know that Isaac was forbidden to go is what the servant asks. He says, perhaps the woman may not be willing. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? And Abraham said to him, see to it that you do not take my son back. So Abraham steadfastly and adamantly refused to allow Isaac to go back there. Whereas Isaac himself sent Jacob there. So Abraham has confidence that the Lord is going to favor this effort. He will send his angel before you. This is verse 7. And you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if she's not willing to come, then you're free of the oath. But you'll not take my son there. Which begs the question, what would have happened had, well, can't rewrite history, we don't know, but Abraham had confidence it wasn't going to happen. He was confident that he'd find a wife and bring her back. So the servant swore and put his hand on the thigh of Abraham. So the servant departed. You have to admire the servant here, the way he did this, and his single-minded devotion, his prayerfulness. Verse 12, he prays, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today. And show steadfast love to my master Abraham. He was selfless. He wasn't just praying that he would have success so he could get out of this or be done with it or get this burden off his back. No. He prays for the sake of his master, Abraham. A true servant heart. Wow. So he asked for a sign. We have to be careful. Truly, genuinely comparable analogies. I do believe, personally, I'll say it up front, I do believe that there are times when signs are appropriate and when it's even appropriate to ask for them. I do. But we do have to be careful. Jesus said to, those who ask for a sign, evil and adulterous generation ask for a sign. So there's a little bit of paradox there. There are occasions when it seems appropriate, God honors it, but it's not to be expected or usual, or just for entertainment, or just for your own personal gratification. Right. So he asked for a sign, and the sign is, he says, let the young woman to whom I shall say this, let her respond. And say, drink and I will draw water, and so forth. We can wonder, I've thought this many times. I've asked for signs on occasion. Rarely, but I have. And I've often thought, okay, if you're going to ask for a sign, if you feel really impressed to do that, then how would you frame that? How would you ask? So I wonder that about Gehazi here. Why would he make this the sign? Well, the response of the woman would indicate itself something about her. Yeah, that's a lot of water. And to volunteer that, and that probably indicates Gehazi was a pretty good student of human nature. He knew if she volunteers this, that tells me something about her own native heart and spirit and character. She's willing to do this. And so, before he had finished speaking, behold, here comes Rebekah. And now the tie back to the end of chapter 23. Born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with a water jar, very attractive, a maiden no man had known, so forth and so on. And the servant ran to meet her and said, exactly his sign. And her answer, exactly the sign. Wow. So, of course, he had prayed about all this beforehand. So, the man, verse 21, notice something else about him remarkable. He doesn't presume, even though he's seen the sign. He doesn't conclude that this is it. He waits to see whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. It's just remarkable. I don't know if I mentioned this class before, but I love to do case studies with students, and one case study I've done a lot in leadership classes is the case of Paul getting to Philippi. And I begin the case by asking this question: how did Paul know he was supposed to go to Philippi? And the answer that most people give knee-jerk is, well, he saw the vision. The man of Macedonia come over and help us. That didn't answer it at all. They didn't even begin to answer it. Well, it begins, but it's a small beginning. No, because first of all, how did Paul get to Troas, and how did he know he was supposed to be there in the first place? Because we know for sure he tried to go to two other places. He tried to go west to Asia. He tried to go east to Bithynia. God said no, due to the Spirit. And why was he going that direction to begin with? That he would have even gone west Asia or east of Bithynia. And even after the vision, we know from the way Luke says what he says next that it wasn't an immediate decision. It wasn't that Paul had the vision and the next morning said, guess what, we're going to Philippi. No, it wasn't that at all. Paul says, we concluded there was kind of a meeting, a conference of the four of them now. But even that doesn't answer it. That only said Macedonia. Come over to Macedonia. Philippi is a city in Macedonia. How did he know Philippi? I don't know. I don't think he was from Philippi.
No.
And the reason I don't think he was, in fact, I'm almost certain he was not, because the phrasing of Acts 16 there says that after they spent some days there, evidently looking for a synagogue, didn't find one, and on the Sabbath they went to the outside the city to a place by the river, supposing there would be a place of prayer. If Luke was from Philippi, he would have known if there was a synagogue there or not. I don't think Luke was from Philippi. Don't know where Luke was from, but I don't think he's from Philippi. Or he would have known. He was a synagogue. And, well, the reason for Philippi is, Luke says, that it was a leading city of the Macedonians and a Roman colony. So Paul targeted Philippi for strategic reasons, but Philippi was not the only city in Macedonia. It wasn't even the first city he came to. He came to Neapolis first, but he didn't stay there. Went straight to Philippi. Okay, what in the world? All that is by way of illustrating the kind of posture of the servant who gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. And then, of course, we read on. He finds out who she is. She's from his family, which that's part of his waiting to find out, because he doesn't know from whom she is. And Abraham told him specifically, from my family. He doesn't know that yet. He learns that. And so verse 26, the man bowed his head when he learns all this and said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham. So he's a thankful spirit. He realizes now that God really has answered his prayer. Or at least to this point, he still doesn't know if she's going to go with him. So, you know the story. They meet, and in typical Oriental fashion, they want to show the hospitality. Remember I telling you the story about my son and me going to the gift shop in East Jerusalem? And I'm an American. I want to pay the money, get the thing, and go. That was my commission. That was my charge for the school. No. Just sit, drink Turkish coffee, talk for a while. Then we'll do business. Exactly this. So the food was set before them, verse 33, but he said, I will not eat. It sounds like an American. I will not eat until I have said what I have to say. And the brother, of course, says, okay, say on. And he does. And he describes the whole situation and gives glory to God for all that. And verse 48, of course, and I bowed my head and worshiped the Lord and blessed the Lord who had led me by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman to his son. Now then, if you're going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me that I may turn to the right hand or the left. Let me know what you're going to do. Very forthright for an Oriental culture. Extremely forthright, especially for a servant. But he was absolutely determined. And he had seen God put things into place, and he wanted to know. He was there on a mission. He wasn't there for small talk. So Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. They acknowledged that. You cannot speak good or bad. By the way, this phrase comes up again. This don't speak good or bad. Whenever Jacob flees from Laban later on, Laban has a dream. Of course, Laban is the father-in-law. And Laban has a dream, and in the dream he is told, don't, when you meet up with Jacob, of course Jacob is fleeing, don't speak anything to him good or bad.
To that point, which I know is ahead, Laban says, you stole my household gods.
Yeah.
Now, if he believed in the God, what are the household gods, I guess? I mean,
Well, it was Rachel who stole them.
right.
But
But he says they were his, though, doesn't he?
well, Laban does, yeah.
Laban, yeah.
Yeah, Laban does.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. And, the same answer to that, I think, forgive me. I'm not supposed to speak with the mouth full of kolache, but that's good. I think it's the same answer for both Rachel and Laban in that. And same answer for a lot of Christians. They may not have little idols they put under the camel saddle, but lots of Christians have their own teraphim. And I think the answer is, it's human nature is always towards syncretism, and this is in the Bible always is the tendency of believers is to drift towards some form of syncretism, true faith, and some superstition, something, whatever that is.
Christianity plus.
Exactly. Christianity, and you got to be baptized or you're not saved, or Christianity, some whatever else, or keeping your hair short or something like that. Excuse me. So, the brother and father answer and say, we cannot speak good or bad. Rebekah is before you. Take her and go and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. And he heard this. He brought out the gifts that Abraham had sent for her and for her family. And so they did finally enjoy the hospitality. And the next morning he gets ready to leave. And her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us for a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go. But he said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered. And apparently there was a kind of a crisis moment where there seems to have been a chance that the whole deal could have fallen through. Because Gehazi was saying, let's go. The prayers have been answered. I don't want to delay. They said, let's wait for a while. And so their answer to all this, when he insists, is let's call the young woman and ask her so she can decide. Will you go with this man? And she says, I will go. Of course, that settles it. But that is a remarkable passage because It's not often that we read where the bride elect has much of a choice.
God must have spoken to her.
Yeah, yeah. That she was willing to go with this man,
A stranger.
a stranger, to marry someone she had never seen. Wow. So but they do bless her and they send her on their way. Now, verse 62, and gosh, we're getting right at the end here. Let me read verse 62 on and make a few comments about Isaac. Isaac has sometimes been called the forgotten patriarch. Abraham, of course, is prominent. He's the father of the faithful. Jacob is the one who has his name changed to Israel. And he's the one who has the 12 sons who become the fathers of Israel. So Isaac is kind of in between, forgotten. He's a little nondescript. And, if we remember anything about him, we remember that he's the one who wanted Esau to go and kill wild game so that he could have a savory meal before he died, which is still a long way off. But at any rate, there, as with Jacob, and Jacob has to learn the hard way, but as with Abraham, excuse me, I'm so sorry. My apologies to those of you who are listening in Utah and have to put up with this. As with Abraham and as with Jacob, Isaac has clay feet. But overall, Isaac comes out looking pretty strong. Well, let me read. Verse 62 says, now, chapter 24. Now Isaac had returned from Be'er Lahairoi. Does that name ring a bell? Be'er Lahairoi. And was dwelling in the Negev. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted and so forth. Who is this man? It is my master. So she took her veil, covered herself. Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Well, this is really a very interesting passage in that, excuse me, it tells us a good deal about Isaac himself. I mentioned Be'er Lahairoi. Anybody think of where you've come across that before?
There is the well of 7 of.
That's Beersheba.
But the bear,
Oh,
doesn't it?
Be'er means well.
Bear.
Be'er means well. Well, Genesis chapter 16, verse 13. She, Hagar, this is when Hagar left, when she ran away. She called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." Or she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahairoi, the well of the God who sees. It lies between Kadesh, and Bered. And we're told in chapter 24 that Isaac had been there. He was there apparently for some time. And we don't know because we're not told. We always have to be careful with any argument from silence. But based on something else that we're told in chapter 24, this might suggest to us that Isaac had gone there specifically to that place, the well of the God who sees, as a kind of a pilgrimage or as a place, a kind of a retreat, perhaps. Because he seems to have been a man of prayer. Look at what it says next in 24, after the mention of the Be'er Lahai-roi. He was dwelling in the Negev, and he went out to meditate in the field toward evening. And this sounds like, at least, this was his practice every day at evening time. He went out to meditate, to pray, to seek the Lord. He seems to have been a man of genuine spirituality. And we see the same thing whenever, and I know it's a little ahead of us here, but whenever Rebecca, of course, can't have children, we read in verse 21 of chapter 25, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer. You know, these are little snippets, but they tell us some pretty important things about Isaac. I mean, the things that really stand out in the descriptions of him are spiritual things. That he was a man of prayer, and as I said, even the mention of the Be'er Lahai-roi might suggest that. We're not told so many words, but it is where Hagar confesses that God sees me, and it stands to reason that maybe that's why Isaac was there. One more thing is that Isaac appears to have been a man of a tender heart. Some have said he was a mama's boy because of the last verse in chapter 24. Isaac took Rebekah into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and he loved her, so Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. And that is kind of a remarkable thing to say. It doesn't necessarily mean he was effeminate or anything like that. After all, he identified with Esau, a man of the field. So there's no reason to think that he was somehow effeminate or anything like that. But and maybe, being, for all intents and purposes, the only son, and certainly the only son of Sarah, he was special in her sight, and maybe had a tender heart, and his prayerfulness. At any rate, that's kind of the picture we have of him, of a man who really was spiritual, loved the Lord, even though he had his moments too of faithlessness in different ways. Well, it is, see by the clock on the wall, boys and girls, that it's time to shut this thing down. To our folks in Utah, if indeed this sees the light of day in the Beehive State, we're signing off. We'll be back Friday, and we'll be anxious to see how this goes. God bless to you all and to those here, and to all of you.